Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Western Spirit. Today, we have with us a very special guest. Professor Niall Ferguson is a world-renowned historian and someone who we love having on. We've had him on before. Professor Ferguson is a fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University and co-founder of the University of Austin, Texas. Niall Ferguson is one of the world's leading voices on history, on preserving Western values, on academic freedom, and someone, when he talks, everybody wants to listen. And so without further ado, let's talk with Professor Niall Ferguson. Professor Niall Ferguson, it's an honor and a privilege to have you back on with us now from far. Before we were close together, but it's an honor nevertheless.
Thanks, Ariel. Good to be back with you.
So I wanted to ask you, in the past few months, I think maybe since the beeper situation with Hezbollah, the entire Middle East seems to have changed. So when I spoke to you, it was right after the October 7th attack, pretty much, I think a month or two after. Israel was at its lowest point we've been maybe ever. And now the entire situation has totally turned on its head. The Iranian regime seems to be on its tail. Israel seems to be getting stronger, more influential. The Hezbollah is basically totally destroyed, almost. Hamas, we don't even need to talk. Bashar Assad's gone. All Iran's, supposedly, its anti-air defense system is destroyed. How do you look historically about what's happening here?
It is indeed a wonderful transformation of the situation compared with when we last spoke, which was in February. And as you rightly say, that was a low point because, as I noticed in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, the mood, although there was resolve, was grim. People felt that their families were at risk, that their kids were in the front line in what looked to be an unwinnable conflict. Israel seemed to be surrounded on all sides. My friend Jay Menz calculated that Israel was fighting on 7 fronts, which is a large number of fronts for a relatively small country to be fighting on. So what has changed? It's something I've been thinking a lot about. One thing that I think we should acknowledge is that Prime Minister Netanyahu, whom the world has heaped opprobrium on, and who's also been much criticized by his fellow Israelis, has achieved almost Bismarckian levels of strategic, operational, and tactical success. And he deserves credit for having got Israel out of an extremely tight spot, having defeated its enemies, in the case of Hamas and Hezbollah, to a substantial extent. But more importantly, what he's done has been greatly to weaken the situation of Iran, which is the principal backer of organizations like Hamas and Hezbollah, is the real problem. And he has long said it's the real threat to Israel's existence. Finally, I think one should recognize that the global context has changed in ways that he could not claim credit for. The US election has delivered a resounding victory for Donald Trump, who is a friend of Israel, and who I think can be relied upon to provide much more unequivocal support than the Biden administration did or a Harris administration would have. So there's been this combination of effective leadership by Mr. Netanyahu and a change in the international circumstances. That's not to leave out the variables in the region that are so numerous we could spend the rest of this show just listing them. Nobody that I know expected the collapse of Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria. We got entirely accustomed to that regime being propped up by Russia and by Iran, despite the crimes that it had committed against its people. And for it to disappear in what seemed like the blink of an eye was one of the black swans of the year. That Iran should attack Israel twice and fail twice and reveal itself not only to have a very limited air offensive capability, but also, when Israel attacked Iran, to have a very weak air defense capability. That was a truly amazing turn of events. And I think the last thing I'll add is that the Gulf states have been, while occasionally expressing ritual support for the Palestinians, quietly inactive as these events have played out. They clearly welcomed Trump's victory. They clearly hope to resume the Abraham Accords process after the new administration comes into office on January the 20th. And I am hopeful, therefore, that there's going to be a full-scale regional realignment by the early part of next year. I shall add one final point, Ariel. Mm-hmm. Henry Kissinger taught me that every success is an admission ticket to the next crisis. So let's not get the champagne out prematurely, because this is the Middle East, and there is always something. But right now, compared with February, this is a dramatic improvement, and I think a vindication of those of us non-Israelis, non-Jews, I include myself with Douglas Murray in this category, who have stood by Israel, cheered it on, and consistently pointed out where the enemy lies.
Yes, and I want to just ask you on that point, because when we spoke last time, you were very worried about Jews in the world and the West's ideals are being attacked all over, whether it's in the West from within, the sort of woke culture, the culture against free speech, against the free expression of ideas. We spoke about that on college campuses, and I'll ask you about the University of Austin that you're part of later. But I mean, how does Israel come into this, Israel's successes on the battlefield, but also just in general, why is it important for Israel? We generalized about it last time. Maybe you could just a little bit expound. Why is Israel important to the West at large?
Well, I'll just give you an illustration of the ongoing problem on American campuses. I hear today that a Columbia University professor, Joseph Massad, who called the October 7th massacre, quote, astounding, quote, awesome, and, quote, incredible, is going to be teaching an undergraduate course, The History of the Jewish Enlightenment, this spring semester at Columbia. So we have a long way to go before the problem of anti-Semitism, describing itself as anti-Zionism, is dealt with on the major campuses in the United States. It matters because, as far as I am concerned, and this has long been my view, we all have a collective responsibility to learn from history. The worst episode in history, by any real measure, was the Holocaust, when a very sophisticated country, Germany, which had the most advanced universities in the world in the 1920s and a functioning democracy until 1933, perpetrated an attempted genocide against the Jewish people. And it doesn't matter whether you're Jewish or not. If you believe in Western civilization, you should believe that that can never happen again. And you should not only say that, but you should act on that basis. October the 7th, in my view, was an attempt to provide a trailer for a second Holocaust, to indicate what a second Holocaust would look like, and to encourage the people who would carry that out to feel emboldened. And so my response to those events was very clear and categorical. We should be united with Israel against the perpetrators of that hideous massacre, because that is only the beginning of what they intend. And we should also trace back responsibility as far as its point of origin in Tehran. So I think that response was the right one. Unfortunately, we didn't see that response in a great many institutions in the United States, and particularly in the great established universities, including Harvard, where I taught for 12 years, and Stanford, where I'm currently based at the Hoover Institution. So there's a lot of work to do to try to correct what is very striking, the shift in sentiment towards Israel that has occurred within American higher education, even at institutions that historically have had quite high representations of Jews on the faculty or in the undergraduate body. What has gone on? It's clearly not the radical anti-Semitism of the old right. Fascists are notably absent from the campuses of the United States. So we're looking here at an interesting combination the old Marxist-Leninist anti-Zionism, which you can trace back to Soviet propaganda in the 60s and 70s, plus Islamist elements that have been imported into American universities with money from the Middle East that has gone to most of these universities. And then a third category, which I'll call the woke anti-Semitism of the useful idiots who carry around placards saying queers for Palestine or gays for Gaza. And that coalition of old Marxist-Leninists, Islamists, and useful idiots has become dominant at many institutions. It'll take many years to correct that because a lot of the people responsible are deeply entrenched with tenured positions. They're not just undergraduates who come and go every 4 years.
Professor Ferguson, I wanted to ask you about just before Trump won the election, it seemed to me that the Biden administration, I think it's obvious, the Biden administration kept on doing a two-faced approach, meaning they would say we support Israel, they would send at least most of the weapons, and at the same time they kept on with, but Israel needs to stop doing this, but we need more humanitarian aid, but etc. Do you think that the fact that Hamas and other organizations here saw that motivated them not to come to the table for, let's say, a hostage deal or to hold out on, meaning, do you think that being not fully throated behind Israel gave a sort of incentive to our enemies to be a little hesitant about giving up?
I think that you're right to characterize the Biden administration's approach as two-faced. Joe Biden's an old school 1970s era Democrat whose default setting is to be pro-Israel. But younger people, and they were all younger than him in the administration, had somewhat different constituencies in mind, including constituencies in states such as Michigan with large Muslim populations. And they knew they had a problem there. Domestic politics looms large, particularly in an election year. And so as time went on, the Democrats became more and more panic-stricken about the votes that they risked losing. And so you got this two-faced or forked-tongued policy. And that's the thing that I don't think is too surprising. And you're right that it was bound to be an encouragement to Israel's enemies. It did no good to say, as Joe Biden periodically did, we stand by Israel, and to supply significant amounts of aid and weaponry if the next day you turned around and said, but you must immediately negotiate a ceasefire, even although Hamas still controls significant parts of Gaza and holds hostages. This really, I think, was unhelpful and counterproductive from an American point of view, too, because the United States, I think, has seldom looked more impotent in the Middle East than it did in the past year. Netanyahu found that he could effectively ignore what was being said. I mean, I think the challenge for the Trump administration will be to reestablish American influence in the region and credibility, because I think influence and credibility have been very badly damaged by Biden and his administration.
Yeah, and I think it's no secret that we're talking on Monday, and right now, right before you came on, I just saw the news in Israel, and the defense minister was in the Knesset in the Foreign Relations Committee and saying that we're the closest we ever were to a deal, and Hamas has agreed to terms they never agreed to before. So even if the deal doesn't happen, the fact that Trump gets elected, he puts out this Truth Social saying they better release the hostage or else. Yeah. And they right away come to the table and start saying, okay, we're ready to talk. We're ready to give in. I don't think it's a coincidence. Enemies understand strength, right?
Correct. I wrote a piece for Barry Weiss's Free Press on the global vibe shift, saying while many people recognize the U.S. vibe shift from Silicon Valley to the voters of Pennsylvania and all the other swing states, not many people foresaw that there would be an almost instantaneous global vibe shift. And this is just the latest example. I loved that particular truth, and I love the fact that you can call them truths. Whoever decided that they should be called truths deserves some kind of Medal of Freedom. And so this was an especially good Trump truth, and of course it's had its effect. Indeed, even before that, the Qataris were telling the leadership of Hamas to get out of town. I think that happened the week of the election. So things have been very, very decided and marked and dramatic and good.
Who do you think, this is a weird question because it's sort of, Joe Biden is the president right now, but it seems like Trump is already president. So he's going and meeting, he goes to the cathedral in France, he meets all the leaders, he's meeting Zelensky, he's negotiating, right now his negotiator for hostage dealings is in Israel, speaking with all the leaders. Historically speaking, was there ever a president that, it seems like the current president is like in retirement and the new president hasn't taken office yet, but he's basically the president already? This episode is brought to you by Globius, the go-to agency for scaling brands on Amazon, Etsy, eBay, and more. Are you running a brand and wondering how to take things to the next level? Whether you're already selling on Amazon or thinking about it, Globius has an amazing offer for our listeners. They're giving away a free market research and action plan to help you understand your market, analyze your competition, and uncover growth opportunities. Here's how it works. Hop on a quick call with the Globius team, and they'll do all the heavy lifting, from analyzing your category to crafting a custom roadmap for your success. No catch, no commitment, just actionable insights tailored to your brand. To grab this offer, visit globius.io/podcast or click the link in the show notes. Don't miss the chance to get expert advice and a clear path to grow your brand. Now let's get back to the show.
I can't think of a comparable transition of power, even when Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980 during the hostage crisis. Jimmy Carter was still president until Inauguration Day, albeit a gravely weakened president whom not many people were listening to. This is different. Joe Biden has essentially been the invisible president since the summer, when he was replaced as the Democratic nominee by a curious kind of coup within the Democratic Party led by former President Barack Obama, former Speaker Nancy Pelosi, and the Republican Senate leader, Chuck Schumer. They forced him out, threatening him, I'm told, with a constitutional move to declare him incompetent to be president. They insisted that Kamala Harris should be the candidate, the worst candidate the Democrats have in fact fielded since McGovern. And she got destroyed in all the swing states. So this is an amazing sequence of events. The most amazing part of it has been that Joe Biden has remained president despite clearly no longer being competent to be president through all of this. Not surprisingly, world leaders are treating Donald Trump as de facto president. In fact, Jill Biden appears to regard him as president. She seemed to be on decidedly good terms with the president-elect in Notre Dame. And all kinds of negotiations are going on, not only with respect to Israel and the hostages, but also with respect to Ukraine, where President Trump has surprised his many critics by showing a considerable sympathy towards the situation of President Zelensky of Ukraine, even appearing in a blue suit with a yellow tie, a very clear signal of where he's coming from. That can't have gone down well in the Kremlin, where President Putin was hoping he'd get Ukraine handed to him on a plate. That's clearly not going to happen. And the transition team, as it's being announced, is a little bit like those truths that come out on Truth Social. It's a statement of intent in many ways. So yeah, all over the world, the enemies of freedom, the enemies of the United States, the enemies of Western civilization, are feeling a great deal less secure than they felt prior to November 5th. And that is a good thing.
Yeah, Professor Ferguson, one thing that I think I wanted to get your opinion on is we spoke about the sort of woke Marxist right, left. I want to ask you about the right. There's a lot of the Trump MAGA movement, big supporters are a sort of mix of isolationists and even some borderline anti-Semitic. Like, for example, you were interviewed not too long ago, I saw on Ben Shapiro, about the Tucker Carlson interview on Churchill with, I forgot the guy's name, but forgive me, but I don't
very forgettable person, Daryl Cooper.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I can still remember it, but we should probably all agree to forget it.
Yes. But I don't want to talk about that I think it's very, very weird that, first of all, that he agreed to interview him, but also like even someone like me who's not an historian understands a lot of what he said is just garbage. But I think on the broader level, are you worried that maybe Trump will implement not isolationist policies, but that the next generation of Republicans will be isolationist in a very bad way? America can't isolate itself, really.
Isolationism has been tried before. It never works because the United States doesn't have the option of just kind of going home and shutting the door and ignoring the rest of the world. You can't do that because the rest of the world simply won't let you. I don't think, therefore, isolationism is something that we should get worried about. In any case, I don't think Donald Trump's an isolationist. And the campaign was a very clearly framed campaign with the slogan, peace through strength, almost as prominent as make America great again. Peace through strength, of course, is a Reagan-era slogan. It was a slogan that Ronald Reagan used in 1980 as a critique of détente. So if one looks at Trump's record, he's really not an isolationist. In fact, he compared himself during the campaign with President William McKinley. Now, that was partly in connection with the McKinley tariff. Trump's point was that McKinley was one of those few presidents who was very explicitly pro-protection. And Trump likes to tell people that he loves tariffs, that he's tariff man, not necessarily convincing economists who think naively that he's just talking about putting taxes on imports, whereas Trump sees tariffs as a tool that you use to negotiate deals, and a more effective tool than sanctions, which is the preferred economic tool of the Biden-Harris administration. But the other interesting thing about McKinley was that he was a tremendous empire builder who, in the wake of the Spanish-American War, added Guam, Puerto Rico to the United States empire, in effect, also the Philippines. And if memory serves, Hawaii was annexed under McKinley too. That's not isolationism, it's kind of the opposite. And if that's Trump's idea of a role model, then I think isolationism is something that will really die on Tucker Carlson's podcast, and it'll die fast if he continues to interview obvious neo-Nazi lunatics like Darryl Cooper or real-life fascists like Vladimir Putin.
I want to ask you also about another interview debate that you had. I saw on YouTube not too long ago with, I forgot the guy's name again, about through, I think, the Hoover Institution, at least the person who was doing the moderating was Peter
Robinson was
Peter
my
Robinson,
colleague who agreed under the auspices of Zero Hedge to moderate a conversation which it's fair to say revealed a certain ignorance on the part of my opponents about Eastern Europe, specifically Ukraine and its relationship to Russia. I mean, the interesting thing here is that there are people, I think they're naive or ill-informed, and they think they're being transgressive, who like to represent American support for Ukraine as yet another neoconservative forever war. And I've struggled to understand why they don't see the real analogy as being between Putin's invasion and attempted annexation of Ukraine and Saddam Hussein's invasion and attempted annexation of Kuwait. I didn't hear anybody say that we should just have handed Saddam Hussein Kuwait on the ground that, well, you know what, it's not really worth sacrificing American lives or even American money for Kuwait. Unlike Kuwait, Ukraine is a democracy. Unlike Kuwait, it's doing a lot of, nearly all of the fighting itself with only weapons from abroad. We haven't sent any troops at all to Ukraine. And it's a struggle for me to understand why any red-blooded American wouldn't want to side with the Ukrainians fighting for democracy and independence against an empire. I mean, that's the standard American narrative. And anybody who's been to Ukraine and talked to young Ukrainians who are in that fight will realize that this is the kind of thing that you don't have to think too hard about to know who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. So when you have a debate like that, you just are reminded that, as Larry Summers once said, there are idiots. Look around.
Yes, but I also think that there is a sort of strain. I think there's two. Tell me if you agree. There's two types of people who are criticizing the war in Ukraine. There are the people who say, we don't need to get involved, stuff like that. But yes, Ukraine is the good guys. But then there are people that, and I think the guy you were debating is on that side, that actually think that Russia is the good guys. There's a sort of strain that you don't have to maybe agree that we should be involved to say, I hope Russia loses. I don't want to get involved. But
it's a little odd, isn't it? The kind of desire to represent the war in Ukraine as the fault of the United States,
yes,
and to depict the Russians as the victims of American aggression. This takes a almost heroic misreading of history. I mean, one can certainly criticize the way in which the negotiations were handled about NATO membership for Ukraine, because the worst thing in the world is the possibility of NATO membership without it's ever been delivered. And Henry Kissinger pointed out in 2014 how dangerous that was. I think one can certainly acknowledge that to talk about making Ukraine a NATO member but not deliver it created vulnerability, real danger for Ukraine. I said that at the time too. I kept warning that to kind of be like that New Yorker cartoon, the New Yorker cartoon when the guy's on the phone in his Manhattan office and he says, "No, I can't do Tuesday. How about never? Could you do never?" And that was kind of our policy on NATO membership of Ukraine. It was like, yeah, but just never. That wasn't a good or smart thing to do. But let's not forget that Putin went into Crimea and created puppet states in the Donbass in response to the Ukrainians trying to get rid of a corrupt president. Indeed, they did get rid of him, named Yanukovych. The annexation of Crimea and the attempt to create puppet states in the Donbass were violations of international law, and the United States was bound by an international agreement, the Budapest Memorandum, to prevent that kind of thing from happening. So unless you regard international law and international agreements as just worthless pieces of paper, then the United States and its allies, its European allies, had a meaningful obligation to stop this, as well as self-interest, because it's not good for the stability of Europe, in which the United States has a large investment, for there to be a successful act of aggression like the annexation of part of Ukraine by an increasingly fascistic Russia that clearly isn't going to stop there.
Professor Ferguson, another thing that we keep on hearing is that America's biggest threat is actually China, and therefore we need to take Putin out of China's grasp and bring him into our fold, and that is why we need to finish this, give him what he needs, basically. That's the basic gist, and bring him to be our friend so that we can defeat China, or at least make China weaker without having Putin on their side. First of all, is China really I think it is, but what should America do? Should Trump do now with China? And is that a strategy in any way to try to get Putin out of his grasp?
Well, it's certainly true that China poses a bigger military and economic challenge than Russia, because China is a superpower and Russia no longer is. And China is a superpower in all the domains that matter these days, from artificial intelligence to quantum computing to space technology to drone technology. So there's no question that we have to take China seriously, and we must make sure that the same thing doesn't happen to Taiwan that happened to Ukraine. We need to understand that Israel, Ukraine, and Taiwan are democracies threatened by the autocracies, and the United States has commitments to all three. The key issue is that you can't separate these threats. The Chinese are now working hand in glove with the Russians and the Iranians and the North Koreans in what deserves to be called an axis.
Yes.
And that axis would benefit, clearly, if we folded in Ukraine and handed the country to Putin. That would be a huge win, not just for Putin, it would be a huge win for Xi Jinping. And I think one of the things that changed in the last year was that Republicans, particularly in the House of Representatives, went from a naive view, oh, who cares about Ukraine? That's a democratic war, to, hang on a second, this guy Putin seems to be backed by China and we're kind of the anti-China party. That kind of shift of sentiment was very discernible. And it's why the Republicans in the end voted to restore aid to Ukraine. It was explained to them that letting Ukraine lose, which cutting off aid basically implied, would be to let not only Putin win, but the whole Axis win. And I think not only Donald Trump got that message, but so did J.D. Vance, whose rhetoric changed on Ukraine in the course of the election campaign. So I think people understand that you've got to deal with these strategic threats simultaneously. You can't cherry pick or just choose one. There are those who make the argument that we should just focus on China. Elbridge Colby, for example, who people occasionally discuss as a possible member of the administration, though I don't think he's yet received the call from President-elect Trump. But I would say that the majority of Republican national security theorists or thinkers understand that this is not really a good idea, and that part of the reason that things went wrong for the Biden-Harris administration was that they failed to deter in Afghanistan, they failed to deter in Eastern Europe, and then they found that they'd failed to deter in the Middle East too. You've got to actually recognize that one action has consequences on the other side of the world that you may not foresee. So peace through strength implies containing and preferably rolling back the four authoritarian regimes that now are a kind of axis.
Yes. And it is just before I go on to the University of Austin in Texas, which I think we're going to close off with, is there anything looking back that Joe Biden and his administration did that turned out well on the world stage? I can't think of one thing that is actually, we can say Joe Biden did a big thing, a support for an ally. Because even in Ukraine, I see now, they first said that they first supplied them with weapons, but then they sort of slow walked it. And then they also said they can't use them to shoot into Russia. Now they did say they could use them to shoot into what did the administration do that we can now look back and say, oh, that was a good decision?
Well, I think Jake Sullivan's idea that you could use technological containment against China by restricting the Chinese access to the most sophisticated semiconductors has worked quite well, although it was never going to be a perfect solution because technological containment can never be forever, and the Chinese have been able to think of ways around those restrictions. But I would say when the Commerce Department issued those restrictions in 2022, severely restricting China's access to the most sophisticated semiconductors, that did strike a pretty effective blow against China's AI competition with the United States. I'd say that in that sense, the China policy was the most successful part of the Biden administration's foreign policy, but it was essentially inherited from the Trump administration. It was the thing that they changed the least because they didn't get rid of the tariffs and they just carried on the tech war. Still, credit where it's due.
So now I want to get to your partnership, your co-founding of the University of Austin in Texas. And so there was just a 60 Minutes story about it. And I think that the fact that they're even covering it means that it's having an impact. People are noticing it. So maybe just give us why, first of all, what is it? Why was there a need for this?
Well, 3.5 years ago, a small group of us, very dissatisfied with the state of the established universities, met in Austin, Texas, and decided it was time to give up on reforming the established universities and start something new in the great American tradition, the way that Chicago was founded in the 1890s and Stanford. We decided we would create a new university and we would reinvent the university because it's time. You know, the institutions are clearly in need of modernization because many things that seemed like a good idea, like tenure, for example, or departmental structures, These things have turned out to be a major part of the problem in our time. The University of Austin is a reinvention of the university. We have reinvented university governance in ways that I think are very important because we guarantee academic freedom through a constitution. And we also guarantee that the president and the faculty can't become political activists because the university is committed to the pursuit of truth, not to any particular political cause. And it's constitutionally prevented from engaging in discrimination on the basis of religion or race or anything else. We're only interested in the pursuit of truth and academic excellence. That's it. So it's, I think, a novel institution in a great many ways. What we're doing, because we're constrained by the system of accreditation, is offering an undergraduate program. We can't yet do graduate studies to US students. We can't yet take non-US students. They are with us now. We have our first class that has just completed its first term, doing our intellectual foundations program, which I believe is the best first-year program that a freshman in the United States could possibly wish for. Combines the classic books of philosophy and literature with fundamental quantitative and technical methods indispensable for STEM subjects. So it truly is the intellectual foundation that a young person needs, whatever they want to go on and study. I'm hugely excited by the quality of students we've attracted. We're rapidly growing our faculty. We intend to be a fully fledged competitor of the Ivy League institutions by the end of this decade. We're going to grow this university the way Chicago grew in the 1890s. They quintupled their student numbers in a decade. We'll do the same. And I think in the process, we'll not only create a new university in Texas, we'll also create competition that will force the established institutions to change. That's my ultimate motivation.
And I just spoke with Bill Ackman for our newspaper, and I think he's one of the big backers and
he is.
Behind the idea also. It's very important to him, competition, and he's very against this whole DEI, and it's very important to him what you guys are doing. So he has a lot of good things to say. I want to ask you one last question, because I was just thinking about, as you were saying about, we just had, I think 2 days ago, in the early 2000s, the Duke lacrosse case where these 3 or 4, I forgot, white kids that played lacrosse in Duke were accused by this woman stripper that they raped her. The case became this big thing. It was all over the magazines and the TV. Turned out the lead prosecutor was hiding evidence. They made it into a race thing. These kids' lives were basically destroyed. And the University of Duke, the dean, he apologized years later. I just watched the whole thing. He at the time came out and expelled them from the team. And now it turns out 20 odd years later, the woman who's now in prison for murdering her husband or boyfriend says she made it all up. She admits. And where do you go back to get your reputation after 20 years where people can still say you were a rapist? And one of the things that we saw during the Obama administration, and I think the Biden administration, was these tribunals in the colleges system where people couldn't face their accusers. They couldn't basically defend themselves. There was these DEI judges. Where do you see, how do you look at this?
Well, I'll be brief since we're almost out of time, but due process has been lacking on American campuses for much of the past 20 years. And these kangaroo courts are a terrible smear on the reputation of the universities that allowed them to operate. It is fundamental to the way our university will operate that there is due process and that one cannot be dismissed or expelled on the basis of a show trial or a kangaroo court. That is something that matters a great deal to me because I've seen many lives ruined or at least damaged by this kind of thing. I hope that we are turning a corner and that the Trump administration will mean what Donald Trump said when he pledged in a very impressive video to transform the way that American higher education works, not only to rid it of the diversity, equity, and inclusion bureaucracies, but I think more importantly, to restore rule of law to our campuses.
Yeah.
You got to remember that it's foundational for Western civilization that there should be due process and that one is innocent until proved guilty and not the other way around. One of the most corrosive features of the last 20 years, which culminated in the Me Too movement, was the strange belief that certain accusations didn't require to be substantiated, that false witness could be born and the woman's testimony would be believed regardless of protestations of innocence. I deplore that change in our culture, and I hope that we'll see it mended in the coming 4 years.
Professor Niall Ferguson, it was a pleasure talking to you as always. And the next time you're in Israel, we're invited again. So thank you so much for being with us.
Ariel, I'm sure I'll be there in 2025 and look forward to seeing you. All the very best.
Thanks for tuning in to the Western Spirit podcast. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. See you next time.